Ladies and gentlemen, I have two short announcements. The session will begin in another 5 to 7 minutes. That's the first announcement. The second announcement is pertaining to this wallet in my hand. It was lying at the seat at the back. If you know anybody who's missing a brown Levi's wallet, please tell them that it's with the Darbar Hall venue manager and they can find me right here and it will be returned. Thank you very much. Please give us 5 to 7 minutes. We're sorry about the delay. We'll start as soon as possible. Nayomi Munaweera, Freeman, and Romesh Gunasekera, and the session will be introduced by Supriya and Nair. I would like to invite all the participants up on stage, and I would like to pass on the mic to Supriya for the introduction. Please welcome our participant.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope lunch was good and that it's been a great first morning at the festival. Just give us a minute while we mic our authors up. I'm fine. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here this afternoon. As I was reading the 3 novels from which we're going to hear today at this session, I tried, as reviewers do, to look for commonalities, critical commonalities that we could, beyond the obvious, naturally, that we could ascribe to, categorically to these novels, to say that these were things that they contributed to a national literature. And I came across something that Romesh said in a recent interview where someone asked him, "Do you think there's such a thing as island writing?" To which he answered, "All novels are islands. As Prospero might say, all art relies on the idea of an island. Although one pushes the form and tries to break barriers, a story is something contained in a world that is a kind of island. It may well be true that no man is an island and we're all connected, but it is also true that each person, mind, city, room, planet, and book is an island. Perhaps stories that locate themselves more obviously on smaller islands magnify that element. The island or the book becomes the crucible where you can see things happen." He then went on to say, beyond that, categories of this kind are mostly useful for sorting your bookshelves, and that only up to a point, which I find very useful. And indeed, if there is one thing common to all these books and their relationship with the idea of nation, and the Sri Lankan nation, it's that all of them are about an enormously diverse cast of characters, histories, cultures, the continents within the island, through which national history and recent national history runs like a straight line. This is in fact literally true of Rue's book on Salmal Lane, in which the road runs through a society of extraordinarily diverse neighbors in a very diverse neighborhood. In Naomi's book, Island of a Thousand Mirrors, a little differently, where families over perhaps more than half a century come together, scatter, divide, break up, and come together again. And in Romesh's novel, which is perhaps in some ways the most straightforwardly post-war of them all. I use that word in a very limited way. There are undercurrents that bind the men and women that our main character, a van driver, meets as he ferries people around the country, both in the north and in the south. I'm going to ask the authors to tell you as much as they please about their own books before they begin to read. And I'd like to start with Naomi. Naomi, would you like to say a few words about the book and then tell us what you're going to read?
Sure. Can you hear me? Is this on?
Yeah, I think it is on.
It is on.
I think once it
Okay.
starts speaking.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Supriya. So my book is called Island of a Thousand Mirrors. It follows two families through the civil conflict in Sri Lanka. One of the families is Sinhala and one is Tamil. It's narrated by the elder daughter of each family, and it sort of follows them through the course of the war. I'm going to read from two places. I'm going to read from a very early part that just gives a little bit of context about what is coming, and this is really set immediately after colonization. Behind the retreating Englishman, on the new nation's flag is poised a stylized lion, all curving flank and ornate muscle, a long cruel sword gripped in its front paw. It is the ancient symbol of the Sinhala, who believe that they are descended from the lovemaking between an exiled Indian princess and a large jungle cat. A green stripe represents that small and much tossed Muslim population. An orange stripe represents the larger Tamil minority. But in the decades that are coming, race riots and discrimination will render the orange stripe inadequate. It will be replaced by a new flag. On its face, a snarling tiger, all bared fang and bristling whisker. If the idea of militancy is not conveyed strongly enough, dagger-clawed paws burst forth while crossed rifles rear over the cat's head. A rifle-toting tiger, a sword-gripping lion. This is a war which will be waged between related beasts. I'm going to skip sort of to a little bit before the middle of the book, and the particular chapter, the sort of part that I'm going to read deals with 1983, and anybody that knows Sri Lankan history or recent history knows that 1983 was incredibly important because there were race riots. And the characters that I'm going to be talking about are two Sinhala characters, Mala and Anuradha. They are the aunt and uncle of the main character who's talking. And the only thing you really need to know is that Mala is pregnant. And it's 83, so they're in the middle of these riots. If we could have followed the dead telephone lines that day, followed them across the burning city, down to our aunt's quiet bungalow and into her bedroom, this is what we would have seen. As smoke rises over Gall Road, as muffled screams make their way over her gate, and though there are still 2 months to go, our Aunt Mala's belly is wrenching and twisting. It is the third day of 24-hour curfew, and Anuradha, white-faced, fingernails bitten past their quick, has been watching his wife writhe for the last 2 days. He says, "The hospital, we have to go." And Mala, gasping, "No, Anu, please, it's the heat and the baby kicking." He says, "All right, I'll go and bring the doctor here." But she can't allow this, has terrible nightmares of what could happen to him out there in the unseen nightmare beyond their gate. He carries her to their old yellow Volkswagen, the tight, battered Bada slippers dangling off her feet. She worries about this, the impropriety of leaving the house in her bedroom slippers. But then Poonam has pulled open the gate, and it is too late to ask for other, more appropriate shoes. They drive into the lane, a lull in the faraway shouting, the street festooned in sunlight and birdsong, foliage spilling everywhere, and for a moment there's normalcy, the sense that they're leaving the house for a walk along Gull Face Green or Mount Lavinia Beach. They turn onto Gall Road. drive into thick, rolling smoke, glimpse armed men, abandoned cars, looted shops. Mala, the aching of her womb, momentarily shocked still, presses a knuckle hand against her mouth. Anuradha whispers, God, as the clearing smoke allows them to see. He is wrenching the wheel around homeward when the hand smacks spray-fingered against the glass next to Mala's head, a teenage boy in a torn, stained school uniform. Behind him, the mob congeals, and the boy, in his terror, scrambles onto the hood of their car. Through the garnet smears on the windscreen, they see the glint of knives, broken bottles, machetes. The mob surrounds them completely now, and although she cannot see the men's eyes, Mala knows they're expecting sacrifice, knows that this Tamil boy in his school uniform, his face squashed against the glass, so close to her own, the open fish mouth, the wide eyes, and that terrible gushing cut on his head, has been chosen as sacrifice for years of deprivation, broken governmental promises, failed examinations, and decades of relentless physical labor. And the boy himself, knowing this, his hands raised to protect his delicate face, does not even beg for mercy. She hears the door slam. She sees Anuradha push through the men, pull himself onto the car, his body in front of the boys. She hears his words through her own shuddering sobs. This child, he has done nothing. He is no problem for you. Her fingers struggle on the lock. She will jump out. They won't hurt a pregnant woman. There are greater human laws they will abide by. She is sure of it. Just outside her window, through the dirty glass, a machete is raised and hefted from hand to hand. She sees the silver gleam of it, sinks low in her seat. Anuradha negotiating, I can give you money, anything, just let me take this boy and go. The voices, what have you got to do with this Tamil bastard, these motherfuckers, ruining this country, think they can take over, time to teach a lesson they won't forget, crack some heads before they murder us in our beds, move aside. Anuradha turns, wraps his arms around the covering boy. His eyes search for hers through the blood-smeared glass. She sees the blade raised and brought down, the flutter of his lids so familiar, his body jerking and then sagging as it has innumerable times over hers in the sanctity of their bed. But this time, it is the unnamed boy who receives his weight, who shrieks the ear-shattering screams of an animal in terror, more blood than she can imagine running onto the bright yellow paint of their car, then 100 hands reaching out and pulling him and the screaming boy into their midst. She's huddled on the floor of the car, arms wrapped about her belly. When the door is eased open, a voice in Sinhala whispers, Nona, come with me. She looks and sees Alwis, the coconut plucker, slum denizen. Nona, let us go home now. His calloused hands pull her onto the seat and then out of the car. The mob is gathered in front of the car, a blur of limbs and the metallic arc of weapons, but Alwis's sinewy coconut tree clasping arms will not allow her to break away, throw herself in the midst of the mob, beg for her lover's life. She's hurried away. When the smoke has cleared for a moment, she struggles loose, looks back to see men on the upturned car like flies on a fisherman's day-old catch. White cans upturned, gushing petrol, a roar as the spark ignites, catches, bursts into flame, the men's roaring and falling in time to the jumping flames, a circle of men. Those on the periphery pushing forward, curious to see what the center holds. A louder shriek as a sarong catches a flying cinder and the circle scatters open. And what is it that my aunt sees at this moment? Too grotesque to be revealed surely, too horrific to be imagined, but in the name of veracity, it too must be told. Two vaguely human figures lurching in an almost comic fashion, garlanded, each with a flaming tire. Hands bound, black rubber melting onto skin, red flames dancing skyward, funnels of smoke obscuring wide open mouths, a glimpse of damaged eye. The swirl of men closes ranks. The scene is shut off from Mala's eyes like a book of illustrations slammed shut, so fast that she can almost not accept what she has seen. A soft rain of ash is falling, settling into her hair and skin. At her ear, a steady stream of words. She knows she must concentrate on this to avoid losing herself. She knows she must walk home now without allowing what is sheltering within her to pour out like water onto this smoky street. Albus's lips close to her ear whisper, "Look down, glass, madam, all over the road." She trains her eyes on her swollen feet in their tight rubber slippers, watches them curiously as they step carefully over broken glass. They move with a will she cannot recognize as her own. She marvels at these feet, at their earnestness in moving away from loss, at the biology in her that has so assuredly chosen her unborn child over her dying husband. Thank you.
Thank you. A little later in the book, in fact, almost directly after this, you write about the family's funeral rites for Anuradha, in which you say that they turned the mirrors of the house to the wall so that the spirit of the dead man doesn't catch a glimpse of himself and grow attached to the world that he is supposed to leave. How much of this, if anything, has to do with the title of your novel?
That's a really great question. Mirrors are all over the book, as you've noticed. It does have, that moment is important, and it does have to do with the title. There's really, when I was thinking about this title, it took a very, very long time to title this book. It took 80 different titles. We went back and forth before we finally found this. And I really, really connected with this title because when you're thinking about a civil war, really who you're fighting is, you know, the other side of yourself. You know, there's the dual aspect. Tamils and Sinhala are really intimately connected throughout history. So there are all these different moments. That's one of them. There's a moment very early on in the book where the young child is swimming in the ocean, and there's a school of fish, and they scatter, and it's like broken mirrors. So it's very connected to like scenery of the ocean. But yes, that moment also.
Thank you. Romesh, your new book, Noontide Toll, is really a book of many stories told by one voice. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it and then perhaps read from it?
Okay, I will. Thank you very much for sharing this, and thank you all for coming. You mentioned the islands thing, which is, I suddenly realized that the last time I was in this room, it was on a session on islands and fiction. I don't know, some of you may have been here then, so it's quite nice to have that echo. But the metaphor for today for me is a van, because this book is about many things, but it's told by Vasantha, who is a van driver. So my first thing is to tell you a little bit about that. For me, actually, the really important dividing line in the world at the moment for me is between people who read novels and people who read short stories. There's a much more bigger dividing line, of course, in the world, which is between those who read at all fiction and those who don't. But among those who read fiction, short stories, novels. So with this book, what I've tried to do is to cater to both. So there are stories in here, and you can read it as a collection of stories individually or separately, or you can read it from beginning to end, because there's a sort of prologue at the beginning and an epilogue at the end. And Vasantha tells you about his trips around the island. So what I thought I'll do is I'll read you just the beginning to start you on the journey, and hopefully you'll complete the journey on your own. And being in character, I'm going to stand up actually because it's a little easier for me to read. As Vasantha would say, you know, I need to make sure that you've all settled in. You've fastened your seat belts there and ready to go. I'll just read you. It's very short. It's just the beginning. It's called Full Tank, and it introduces a section where he's driving to the north. So this is after the war came to an end in 2009. Vasanta is a retired man. He decides to do what he's always wanted to do, which is drive. And so he buys a van, and he buys a van which makes him the sort of van man, but that has other connotations as well, I suppose. In many countries, including Sri Lanka, there's been sort of problems about white vans arriving and people disappearing and so on for many, many years in the past. So he buys a van and he paints it a different color so it's not threatening. He drives up north to Jaffna for the first time. He does a few trips up there. And so the first half of the book is about his trips north, and the second half is about his trips south down the coast to Gaul and places like that. So this is how it opens. It's called Full Tank. Every time I drive across the causeway to Jaffna, I feel I'm entering another country. The lagoon is as big as a sea. The sky touches it at the edge, on the left and on the right, and the wind makes the ripples look like waves. The fellows at the checkpoint know me so well now, they don't even look at my ID. They crack a couple of jokes about the state of my van and laugh their heads off. I tell them it's a Japanese van. In 1945, Japan was a dump. Nobody thought the Japanese could make even a cup of tea anymore. But now, Toyota is the biggest car company in the world. It's a funny business. I tell them, no one knows who will have the last laugh. Look at Germany. Same thing. German tourists are rolling in it now. Their chancellor is the boss of Europe. Makes you wonder about this business of defeat and victory. Today, I'm the van man for two Hollanders and Mrs. Curé. I get some oddballs in here, but this is the oddest trio in a while. My job is to drive them to Jaffna for one night only. Straight there and straight back. By the end of the trip, we would have spent more hours on the road than in the town. Apparently a guide has been arranged for the morning tour of the place, some crazy scheme for a renovation project or something. Mrs. Curé from the new heritage agency is in charge. You have petrol, no? She asked the moment she got in. She's like the deputy governor's wife I had to chauffeur when I was working at the Coconut Corporation. Before I got my desk job, I used to drive her all around Colombo. It was a good job, even though she was another madcap. I preferred being behind a wheel, going somewhere than behind a desk. That's why I started this business with the van the moment I retired from the corporation. It's a minibus, not a sports car, but it makes me feel young. When I tell my tourists that I retired a year ago at 55, they're astounded. Fucking hell, Mr. Benton from Brighton said. His language surprised me, I have to say. But that's the way the new breed of tourists talk nowadays. Even when they're flip-flopping in their mid-60s and should know the risks of a loose mouth and all that, they come from such developed countries. But they have to stay in service until they lose their marbles. Then they come here on a tight budget looking for their goodies. Sometimes I think the way the world is organized is a joke. The hotel Mrs. Curé booked for the night is off Hospital Street. I've stayed in it before. It's an okay place, but I can't help thinking, we're in a land where every road seems to lead to a hospital. You could say we've been a little damaged by the last few decades, so I guess that's only right. Up here, in this wounded country, even the sky bleeds every evening. The Hibiscus Hotel has no star rating. The porch has been repainted in pink, but there have been no attempts to improvements inside since my last visit. Even so, our group looks happy enough. I think the Dutch have very low expectations. Maybe because they can't see very far ahead with the dikes and all that. How they ever conquered the world, I don't know. Or even how they even set sail on the high seas with their balls of Edam. Soon it's dark, and Kanna, the duty manager, giggles and turns on the colored lights, making the place even more garish. The staff are sweet, but there's a long way to go before a hotel like the Hibiscus hits the mark. Jaffna has never been a major tourist destination, and I tell you, it's not about to be one now. Not just yet, whatever the newspapers say. We start tomorrow at 8 o'clock, Vasanta, Mrs. Kure says, standing under a glass bowl of fuzzy light. The lampshade is swarming with noisy insects. We go to the fort in the morning, and after lunch we have a meeting at the Navla Cultural Hall. You know it? She searches her handbag for something, then snaps it shut triumphant. Never mind, there'll be an army boy here in the morning to show us the way. I bow. Good night, madam. She sprays her arms, the small yellow canister she found in her bag. Good night, Vasanta, she says, and floats over to the reception area to join the others, humming the bouncy song she had made me put on again and again in the van about some sandman bringing us a dream. I make my way to the staff quarters. Kanna says I can have the best room to myself this time. Normally in a place like this one would have to share, but there are no other drivers here tonight, so I can sleep like a king in a land of dead kings. I ask for a cool beer and Kanna laughs. I tell him I've been on the road for 11 hours and I'm very thirsty. He finds the idea of an 11-hour drive an even bigger joke than a cold lion beer. All that way just to stay for one night? What do they want? He asks. Two of them have come from a lot further, I say. From Holland, in Europe. Kanna laughs again. But not from Hague, no? He gives me a beer and a plate of roti. I wonder if he gets Channel 4 or Al Jazeera up here, where there's been a lot of talk about war courts of the Hague. How a small Dutch town like that on the edge of Europe became the conscience of the world is a mystery to me. We could all learn something from that. Out in the garden, beyond the Palmyra, I hear an owl hoot. It's been a long time since I've heard one. An owl. It must mean something. But I'm too tired to remember. All I know is that with a van, at least you're never stuck. You can always get in it and go for a loaf. You don't have to feel trapped. If you're on the move, there's always hope. Thank you.
Romesh, could you take this?
Oh, sorry.
He took maybe you.
Thank you, Romesh.
I keep it away from you. Sorry.
I have a question to ask you about the voice of Vasanta, which is sly and wry and knowing, and which I think is one of that bind the stories of this book together. Is there a Sri Lankan humor? Do you think?
Sri Lankan humor. Goodness me. How would I know, really? No, I don't think so. Some people were laughing here. I don't think they were Sri Lankan. No, I don't. I mean, there is, people like to think that actually in this part of the world, not just Sri Lanka, there is a kind of humor. There is a kind of love of puns, isn't there? Mm-hmm. All over South Asia. But then, is that a South Asian thing? Shakespeare lived off punning, That's right. I think the difference.
And as we all know, he was Kashmiri.
Oh, no. He was actually Sri Lankan. He's very well known. His name is Shakes Pereira. And he's especially known. He's been neglected in his homeland for a long time, but then most writers are,
Prophets.
But he was, and you can tell it from the language and the humor, clearly. But humor hopefully is something that is actually quite universal. The difference is, and I discovered this very late in life, when I wrote my first book, when I wrote my first novel actually, Reef, and I thought I was writing a very tragic, sad novel. And one of the first ever letters I ever got, and in those days there were still letters rather than emails, was from someone who said they loved my book and they were reading and they couldn't help but burst out laughing on the bus. And I thought, laughing? But this is meant to be a really sad story. And then I realized that actually there are lots of jokes in it, and they are very what I thought were very private jokes, very private things, because they were very textual, and they were actually not just puns, but they were textual jokes in the sense that they were jokes that crossed languages. And so I was playing around with lots of things, and I didn't realize that some people would pick up on it. So, a long way of saying an answer to your question is that if there is something special about that kind of humor, it would be really language-based. If you're playing off between English and sing hello and English sing hello and Tamil or something like that, yes. But otherwise, humor is pretty widespread, I hope.
I think you're right on that score. I have follow-up questions, but I would also really, really like to listen to Rue and what she has to read from her great, big-hearted, also very funny novel. Rue, would you like to tell us a little bit about the novel and then read?
Yes. Well, as an introduction, I'll say that the novel is set in the 5 years leading up to the riots in Sri Lanka in 1983. But it's told from the perspective of the children who live down a dead-end street in Sri Lanka, much like the one I grew up on. And the narrator's voice is the street itself. And you look back on what you write and you attribute a meaning to what you did. But when you're first starting out to write the book, you write the book that you feel like writing. But certainly this is a book of my heart, because my heart is wholly Sri Lankan, though I've lived for many years in the United States. And so when I look back on why I wrote the book, I would say that it is certainly a book that is meant to play some small role in the process of reconciliation in Sri Lanka after the end of the war, after the end of the military combat. And in doing so, the book focuses mostly on what life was like in Sri Lanka before the war, rather than what life was like in Sri Lanka after the war, because I think it's only when you know what is lost that you can think about what you can have again. I'm going to read from, the story begins when a family moves into this neighborhood. They have 4 children, and the section I'm going to read is sort of an introduction to one of the children, the oldest boy, who wants to be a musician. That's really what he wants to be, but his family has other plans for him. And I'm going to put on glasses, which I hate to do, so I must love you a lot. The musician. First son, oldest child, was not a title Suren bore with pride. Indeed, he bequeathed what duties he could to Rashmi with such frequency that Rashmi behaved as though she were the oldest of the siblings, stepping forward to accept instruction and lead the way as if practicing for a lifetime of managing small children. But he could not hand over his gender. That he was stuck with. The maleness of it, and worse, the first maleness, the oldest maleness. It came at him each morning like a patriotic flag, unfurled and snapping into place in a stiff breeze, calling out to him in the guise of all the expectations that had been organized into his schedule, classical music and chess folded into a rich batter of mathematics, the tried and tested path to the airy adult life of an engineer. In his 13th year, on his birthday to be precise, Suren attempted to alter the inexorable course of his life. "I don't want to be an engineer," he blurted through the candle smoke hanging over a specially ordered green cabin cake shaped like a red railway carriage, a cake far more suitable for a different kind of boy, even a differently aged boy. The cake settled neatly at the very center of the oval dining table with its new navy blue tablecloth was surrounded by flat plates filled with elegant tiered tea sandwiches with carrots and beets and crisp cutlets filled with fish, Suren's first birthday food. In the face of these treats, Suren might have been expected to stay quiet, but he, like the other Herath children, was growing up. And growing up usually meant that good behavior, the kind of behavior expected by good parents who had raised their children properly, was destined to be shrugged off as personalities and tastes and a multitude of other characteristics and their accompanying difficulties were discovered. And so Suren did not stay quiet. Mrs. Herath, the one who usually secured cakes and celebrated milestones, leaned forward to relight one of the blue candles stuck on the blue base of the cake. She waved a match in her hand to put it out and then smiled indulgently at her older son. "What nonsense! Of course you want to be an engineer. Everybody wants to be one," she said, barely shocked by his words, but wanting to make sure that she quelled any unseemly expressions of free will. She knew where that led. It led to unsuitable marriages agreed to in moments of spontaneity instead of waited for in the proper way. "Look at the Silver boys, for instance," she continued. "Their mother has told me several times that she's always trying to get them to study and be better than they are. Her dream is to get at least one of them to be an engineer. But unlike them, you, my son, are a genius. You were born to be an engineer." And Mrs. Herath stroked Suren's head lovingly. Suren, already seated at the table, looked up at his mother, who appeared to be particularly cheerful in a pink flowered sari. "Geniuses can do other things," he suggested, sullen but hopeful. "A genius can choose," yes, his mother concurred and corrected at the same time. "But if he chooses foolishly, then what is the use of being a genius? And she moved away from him to set out her favorite small Dankotua porcelain white plates with their delicately pleated edges. Suren watched his mother's activity as he considered this line of reasoning. It seemed to make sense, and yet it did not. For what was the worth of being a genius if choice was denied to him? After all, fools were always told what they should do, and they were foolish because they obeyed. He was about to share these thoughts when help came from an unexpected quarter. His father spoke up. "What is it that you want to do, Suren?" he asked, tapping the butt end of a cigarette on the surface of his left thumbnail. Tap, tap, tap. "I don't want to study to become an engineer," Suren said, a touch of anger creeping in, though his face remained uncreased. "I am good at maths, but I am better at music. That's what I want to do, music." Rashmi gazed at her older brother in dismay. This was not the sort of passion that bode well for the future. Music was a pastime, not a vocation. Yet there Suren sat, his eyes steady, his mouth firm, indeed his whole body straight, but obviously at ease with this ludicrous idea. Mr. Herath nodded slowly, lit his cigarette and exhaled a first puff of smoke. "You want to study music?" Suren looked unsure. Studying was related to graded accomplishments, and he did not care for the latter, particularly since a steady acquisition of A's at schools where A's were parceled out in single digits each year had kept him from the enjoyment of life in general and music in particular. "You want to play music?" Mr. Herath asked, watching his son and trying very hard to stay focused. The failure of the recent strike and the plight of Mrs. B lay heavy on his mind. Still, although Mr. Herath wanted more than anything else to pick up the perfumed telephone and round up some friends with whom he could discuss what avenues remained for addressing the needs of the fishermen, the rural and urban poor, the voiceless, yes, he did think in such terms, and the possibility of securing the release of comrades who had been incarcerated in the aftermath of the strike, he had decided to make a special effort to be present for the momentous occasion of his oldest son's entry into the teenaged years. This was a heavy price to pay, and he wanted his presence to count. So he asked the question again. "You want to play music?" "Yes, that's what I want. I want to play music." "That's what you're doing, playing," Mrs. Herath said, her voice sharp, as something familiar and bilious rose in her belly the way it had done before the birth of each of her complications. "You play the piano, you play the flute, and I hear that you're even talking about playing the guitar." Can we cut the cake now? Rashmi broke in, knowing full well when her older brother needed to be rescued and hoping that he would be grateful for the diversion. But Suren plunged ahead. I want to play music forever. I don't want to do it after school and practice pieces and do it on the side like a hobby. I want it to be all I do. I want to be a musician, he finished, unable to keep the triumphant note from the end of his speech. Both his parents spoke at once, and Suren was momentarily thrown off balance by the equilibrium between them, the joint postponement. His mother, cake knife emphasizing her words, and how will you live? Who will support you? Who will want to marry you? His father, good, but if you want to play music, you must study music first. If you love music, you don't need to study it, Suren said at last, choosing the parent of least threat, even though experience had taught him that if something needed to be done, his father was also the parent of last resort. At this, and over the warning murmurs of his wife, Mr. Herath exercised authority by adjourning the game. We can talk about all this another day. Look, Rashmi has cut the cake. Let them eat cake, he said, stubbing out his cigarette and launching himself out of his seat with a celebratory rubbing of his palms, as though he could, when the occasion warranted it, enjoy such bourgeois things as birthday cakes.
Rue, you make quite explicit reference in this book to another one in which the wider world and its politics intrude into the consciousness of a child or children and change it forever. This is To Kill a Mockingbird, which I found very interesting. But I also find it really interesting that you say that you grew up on a dead-end road, much like Salman Lane. How much of this is biographic? Well, how much of this draws from lived experience for you?
You'd have to come to my panel on Sunday to hear the answer to that question. Sorry.
Okay.
So,
Well, if you prefer
yeah.
not to talk about it, perhaps we can go back to sort of,
Yeah.
you know, your literary influences when
No, I'm
writing
happy
this.
to answer the question.
Okay.
I'm just
Yeah,
joking.
please. No, that's fine. We all understand about keeping suspense.
Yeah.
But please do go ahead.
So I grew up on a street like this in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, and the thing about that is that it's a street that I grew up on, but it is not particular to me in the sense that almost every street in Colombo looks like this. It has a mix of races, a mix of social classes, except generally the very rich and the very poor. But in between, all the different layers are usually to be found, and the rest of them are also found not that far away. But in terms of the religious and ethnic groups, they're all mixed together. And I chose it because it's familiar to me, but it is also a microcosm of the country itself, which looks like this.
Thank you. We have some time for questions from the audience, so perhaps we can open it up and then see if we have some time to do a little bit more chatting. But please.
I see a lady in the middle.
My question is to Romesh. In his stories and novels, I observed that he does not go into the details of the physical descriptions of the character. And
Not going to the descriptions of the?
physical, whether the character is tall or
All right,
black or
yeah,
white.
okay.
And my question is, how it makes your story different from the others, and why you do this?
Why do I do this?
I suppose, your style can be said not to be as directly visual as perhaps Naomi's. So,
Okay, so the question is, why don't I describe people a bit more? Probably because I need my glasses and can't see very well. But also, I think, in writing, in writing fiction, all of us can write. All of us use the same material. All of us use words. And our vocabularies aren't hugely different. The only person who had a really different vocabulary was Mr. Chaques Pereira. He had a massive vocabulary, literally. I mean, people have analyzed this. But most of us have a very similar thing. And what differentiates a writer is the things you select to put into words. And so it is part of your, for want of better word, style, I guess. But it is, the way I would describe a person will be different from the way other writers would describe their characters. And that is, if you like, that is the signature, really. And I'm a kind of writer who prefers to leave more to the imagination than to fill in your imagination.
Let's just take a question from somewhere behind first when we come back. There's a lady in the center of the hall. Could we pass the mic there?
As a fellow Sri Lankan and a Jaipur Literature Festival virgin, I'm really absolutely thrilled to see the three of you here. I've been living in Brazil with my children for the last 6 years and recently moved to Delhi. We came back from a holiday in Sri Lanka, and my son, who is absolutely proud to be Sri Lankan, is also half English, but he's actually coming in here. I didn't plant him at all. Took in the Sri Lankan flag on Wednesday to his show and tell and asked me, "Mummy, how do I describe it?" And I said, "You describe it in your own words." He then later asked me, "Mummy, what's civil war?" And as parents do, you don't ever lie to your children. You give them that one line that you can build on in years to come. Naomi, I read your book in April, bought it in Sri Lanka, took it back to Brazil, read it and cried and cried and cried. And I think the use of mirrors is something that I will use to discuss with my children. But I want to ask Romesh and Ru as well, how would you explain a civil war to children who are in love with a country they've never lived in, although they had visited, who know it not through tsunami or war or abuse of human rights, but know it as paradise. But I would like to explain their history to them as well.
Ru?
I would like to say that I think the war in Sri Lanka is no different in many ways than the war of capitalists against peasants or any other kind of war. It is always something that is waged by powerful people, and it is the people who have no power that suffer. So, I mean, I think that is the best explanation that you can offer, because that is the truth of it when you come down to it. It is not usually that individual people, when, as you know, I mentioned in the prologue, that if you ask individual people, is it okay to go burn somebody or kill somebody, the answer is no. But then if you are swept up in something else that is larger than yourself, or you feel powerless, then you end up doing the things that you don't individually conceive of ever being able to do. So I think that is the best explanation that I can offer.
I think it's a really, really difficult question. I don't think there are any easy answers. It's not peculiar to Sri Lanka, and sadly, the whole world, in some respects, has become more tolerant of violence as a solution to any problem. At any level, not just national level, at domestic levels, at smaller levels, but it's something that I have certainly grappled with in trying to understand. And right from the time when I first started getting published, it, in a sense, coincided with the beginning of the troubles in Sri Lanka. And so I've always, I've tried to understand how is it that something as improbable as what you were saying, Ru, of someone going and burning somebody up or destroying things in this violent way. How can such an improbable thing happen? And it's not peculiar to Sri Lanka, because obviously, the repercussions of that is going on in India at the moment. And there's as much soul searching, if you like, as to how did that happen? In the times of partition, how did it happen? How did these things happen last week or last year? And I think the answer, is part of growing up, of searching for answers. And you have to find a way of explaining this. And I couldn't quite work out how old your son is, but you know, at different ages there are different ways, and I think even in the simplest of stories that young kids read, the issue of bad behavior, if you like, bad moral behavior and violence is something that comes in, and you grow in your understanding. And somebody was asking me in the car, actually, that was explaining how their son was getting totally interested in this whole business of in the Second World War and the rise of Hitler. And what was asking, you know, did that really happen? How did that happen? It's not easy to explain.
Can I add something really quickly? Thank you so much for that question. That's amazing. I think it's really admirable that you are taking up the question, and you know, your son is only 6, but this is something that's really important for us to talk about as Sri Lankans. You know, I was in Sri Lanka last year and taught a writing workshop, and we had youth there, and one of the young women who was about 22, she said until she was 15 years old, she didn't know that there was a civil war in Sri Lanka. Her parents had never told her that, and they would go back and they would stay in resorts and sort of holidays, so she was incredibly shocked, and her friend said, this is happening, and she said, no, it's not. So, I mean, and then of course it was incredibly traumatic for her at 15 to understand that there's this incredible this very painful conflict that she had no idea about. So it's admirable that you are starting that conversation with your child.
Thank you. We have time for one more quick question. So if someone would like to ask and keep it short. Simran? Yes.
Well, I must begin by saying how absolutely delighted I am by having the 3 of you here. It is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and these are writers I would have to travel to ends of the world to meet. Thank you so much for those delightful readings. Mr. Gunasekera, sir, I wanted to ask you, in your novels and your short stories, Monkfish Moon, A House in the Country, for instance, the violence is there. I mean, now, as the lady said, civil war, can I say civil wars in Sri Lanka? There were different wars with different causes. Now, especially in your stories, of course, the story is wonderful and touching, even without knowing those causes. But would it be the, which event were you in? A House in the Country, which event were you? Ranavali, I figured out it's the JVP, the first JVP of 71.
Not the first.
But
not the first.
Not the first?
No.
That's what
I think this is slightly more technical for people here, I guess, because it's to do with one story from my very first book. And it's a question of, I suppose the broader question is how much detail do you need, I suppose, and how do you separate out? Because Sri Lanka has had a very complex history for such a small place, I guess, as complex as it is here, I guess. And so when people talk about the war, generally they talk about the war that came to a military end in 2009, which was really a conflict between the LTT, the Tamil Tigers, and government forces. But it was a war that for many, many years, as you were saying about your student in the class, many people didn't call it a war. In fact, it was, it was denied at all levels as a war for many, many years. And for some, in some years, it wasn't actually a war. It was the kind of conflict that came to an end when there was a test match on, for example, right. Or when there was something else happening. And I think the term war started in the 90s, 95, 96, something around there, after a particular campaign began, actually. But the stories that I was writing in Monkfish Moon were of a period before, and there were different sorts of violence. And I think for me and for people of my generation, I guess, and older generations, the watershed movement of violence was in 1971 when there was a youth uprising which was crushed. And it was the first time in modern history in Sri Lanka where there was a mass level of violence and death, and many thousands of young people died in that. But the story you're talking about particularly was a story set in the 1980s, when there was a lot of violence related and a lot of disappearances, a lot of unexplained violence, and it was a time again of there was another movement, which was a Marxist movement, and a lot of tension. But it was also a time when there was the other conflict going on as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, when we talk about the war in Sri Lanka, it's also, as Romesh pointed out, it was between the LTTE and the people of Sri Lanka, really. It's not necessarily just the government forces, because the people that were killed by the LTTE were indiscriminately of all races and religions and backgrounds. And to make the distinction that the LTTE was Tamil, but not all Tamils belonged to the LTTE. Similarly, that also, lots of people who fought in the government forces were also Tamil, fighting against the LTTE. So it's a complex story, and but it's also, I think if you grew up in Sri Lanka as I did, my whole life has been lived with the war going on. And so you feel it very differently. When I went back when the war had ended, there was a sense of real relief in the country and ease among people that you had carried the whole time. So sometimes people may not be talking about the war, but they're certainly feeling it if you're living there. And it's that pressure that you feel because you're constantly braced for suicide bombs or news of attacks against the LTT in Jaffna or landmines in something. And then when that finished, there was easing of a certain kind of tension. But of course, the process of reconciliation goes on much longer.
And I would just add really quickly, of course, my student might not have been talking about it, but yes, absolutely, living in Sri Lanka, there was no way that you weren't aware of the anxiety and the trauma and the pressure of being in that situation, not knowing if there would be a suicide bombing or, if your kids would get to school safely. Absolutely. So I wouldn't argue with that.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we've come to the end of our time, so we're wrapping up. More questions out, I suppose, off stage. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Nayomi, Ru, and Romesh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to see more people in the room at the end than having fewer people at the end. So thank you.
True.
Thank you for an incredibly enlightening session. That was great. Nayomi, Ru, Romesh, and Supriya. All right, if people on the left-hand side aisle could please note that is an exit aisle, so do not push inwards and try and enter from there. Please queue up on the right-hand side, otherwise there will be no space for people to exit the venue. It's an emergency hazard. We can't